The visitor left before the body was found. A mystery in the tradition of Agatha Christie. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a village after someone dies. Not silence exactly. The birds are still going. The milk still comes. The postmistress still turns her sign to open at 8:30, the way she has done for 31 years. But underneath all of that, something has shifted. Something that cannot quite be named yet. That is where tonight's story begins. Before we go any further, I want to know who is sitting with me right now. Are you tucked in somewhere warm, putting off sleep a little longer, making tea, or already halfway through a second cup? Perhaps the house is quiet around you in that particular way it only gets late at night. Or maybe you are nowhere near home at all. And this is just something to hold on to while the hours pass. Tell me in the comments. I do read them. Tonight's story is inspired by the spirit of Agatha Christie and the world of Miss Marple. No rights claimed, no connection to any estate. Only an honest love for a good village mystery and a cold cup of tea found at the wrong time of morning. The visitor left before the body was found. That is where we begin. Chapter 1. The Fate Committee. The trouble with Edith Crale, as Mrs. Hartley told her husband on the Monday morning before it happened, was that she had never once in her life let a small matter remain small. She had been doing it for as long as anyone in Little Anzwick could remember. A slight against the flower-arranging rota became a 3-week correspondence with the parish council. A borrowed teacup unreturned became evidence of character. She had, over the course of 47 years in the village, turned a natural talent for observation into something considerably sharper, and she used it the way some women used a good pair of scissors, with precision and without sentiment. On the Monday she died, Edith Crale was 71 years old and in perfectly good health. She had attended the Fate Planning Committee at the village hall the previous Thursday. She had, as usual, chaired the meeting without being asked to chair it. She had made 3 separate suggestions about the placement of the tombola, all of which were recorded in the minutes as resolutions, though no one had seconded them. The vicar's wife, Dorothy Hepburn, had written them down without comment, in the neat hand she kept for things she disapproved of. Little Anzwick in August was not at its most comfortable. The hedgerows had gone heavy with blackberry and elder. The lane between the post office and the church was muddied from last week's rain, and Mrs. Bowen at the pub had been complaining for 2 weeks that the beer garden smelled of something dead, and no one had found what it was. The village was in that slightly restless state that comes before a community event, when everyone has agreed in principle to cooperate, and no one has quite begun to. Miss Jane Marple had arrived the previous Tuesday, by the 11:15 from Market Heathwell. She was staying with her old friend Agnes Hollowell, who kept a cottage on Church Lane, and whose hip had not been reliable since February. Agnes had written in July to say she was managing perfectly well, and would Miss Marple please not make the journey simply on her account. Miss Marple had written back to say she quite understood, and had arrived on the Tuesday with a small case and her knitting. She had been in the village 6 days when Edith Crale died. In those 6 days she had attended the morning service at St. Cuthbert's, drunk tea at the post office with Mrs. Fenwick, the postmistress, on 3 separate occasions, been introduced to the new schoolteacher Mr. Ramsay at the pub on Friday evening, and sat for a long time on Agnes's garden bench, watching the lane. Agnes had asked her once what she was watching for. Miss Marple had said she was not watching for anything in particular, which was true. She was simply looking. There was a great deal to look at in Little Anzwick, if you paid the right kind of attention. Edith Crale lived in Hawthorne Cottage, a 10-minute walk from Agnes's. She was a widow of 12 years. Her daughter Marion lived in Bristol and came back twice a year, at Christmas and in August. She had one daily, a woman named Vera Oakes, who came in at 9 and left at noon. She had a garden that was famous, in the local way, for its foxgloves, which grew along the back wall in purples and whites, and which Edith cut back with rather more aggression than was strictly necessary. On Monday morning, Vera Oakes arrived at Hawthorne Cottage at 9:01, let herself in with her key, put the kettle on, and found Mrs. Crale in the sitting room with a cup of cold tea at her elbow and nothing at all to say for herself. Vera stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen and used the telephone to call Dr. Pemberton. Dr. Pemberton came in 12 minutes. He was 62, had been the village doctor for 30 years, and knew Edith Crale well enough to know that whatever else she was not the sort of woman to die quietly in a chair on a Monday morning. He called the constable. The constable called the inspector. The inspector drove up from Market Heathwell and arrived at 11:30 with a sergeant and a brief certainty that this was a natural death and could be dealt with before lunch. Miss Marple heard about it from Agnes, who heard about it from Mrs. Fenwick, who heard about it from Vera Oakes herself. By noon, the story had travelled as far as the pub, by which time it had acquired a detail that was not in any of the original accounts, that the sitting-room window had been open and that someone had been there the night before. Miss Marple, hearing this last part, set down her knitting. She picked it up again almost immediately. But the pause had been there. She thought about the window. She thought about Edith Crale's foxgloves along the back wall, heavy and purple in the late summer heat. Then she thought about something else entirely. A woman she had known 30 years ago in St. Mary Mead, who had poured tea for her husband one way, and for the vicar a quite different way. Not in any dramatic fashion, just in the angle of the wrist, and whether the saucer was offered or simply placed. She did not say any of this to Agnes. She asked instead whether Agnes had seen anyone going up Church Lane on Sunday evening. Agnes said she hadn't been to the window after 7. Her hip. Miss Marple said that was quite all right, and returned to her knitting. Chapter 2. What the Postmistress Knew. Mrs. Fenwick had run the Little Anzwick post office for 31 years, and prided herself on knowing everything about everyone without ever having been caught knowing it. This was a distinction she maintained carefully. There was a difference, she would have said, between being nosy and being observant, and the difference was whether you used what you saw. On the Tuesday after Edith Crale's death, Miss Marple came to the post office to send a letter to her niece. This was the ostensible reason. The actual reason was that Mrs. Fenwick's counter was the nearest thing Little Anzwick had to a clearinghouse for unverified information, and Miss Marple had 3 specific things she wanted to know. She learned them in the course of 18 minutes, which included a considerable digression about the tombola and whether Colonel Finch's wife had been right to donate a bottle of sherry that was already open. The first thing she learned, Edith Crale had received a letter on the previous Friday. Not a bill and not a circular, Mrs. Fenwick said, because the envelope was personal quality paper and had been posted in Bristol. Marion's handwriting, most likely, although Mrs. Fenwick could not be certain because Marion tended to write on Thursdays, and this had arrived on Friday, which was slightly irregular. The second thing, a woman Mrs. Fenwick did not recognize, had been at Edith's gate on Saturday afternoon. A stranger, 40-odd, dark coat, carrying something, not a visitor from the village, not someone passing through in any natural way, because she had stopped at the gate for a full 3 minutes before going up the path, which was not the behavior of someone expected. The third thing, and this one Mrs. Fenwick offered with less certainty, hedging it round with, "I may be quite wrong, of course," and "it's not for me to say." Celia Barton, who had been Edith's closest friend for 19 years, had not been seen at Hawthorne Cottage since the Thursday of the Fate Committee meeting. This was unusual. Celia and Edith had tea together on Sundays as a matter of long habit. The Sunday before Edith died, according to Mrs. Fenwick's particular view of Church Lane, no one had gone up to Hawthorne Cottage before 5 o'clock, and Celia Barton had not been one of them. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Fenwick, sent her letter, and walked home by way of the church. She was thinking about Celia Barton. She had met Celia twice in her 6 days in the village, once at Agnes's for supper and once at the Fate Committee meeting, which Miss Marple had attended as Agnes's representative because Agnes could not walk the distance. Celia was 63. trim and quiet. A retired librarian who had come to Little Anzwick 19 years ago from somewhere in the north. She kept a small house on Mill Road and had a garden that was tidy but not showy. She had been Edith's great confidant, or so it seemed, and had sat beside her at the committee meeting and passed her things without being asked to. Miss Marple had watched her do this. She had noticed something that she filed away without deciding immediately what to do with it. The way Celia Barton passed Edith things was not the way a friend passes things. It was correct in every particular. There was no shortage of courtesy, no visible resentment. But the gesture was deliberate in a way that a long, comfortable friendship usually is not. Long, comfortable friendships get careless. Hands reach without calculation. This was not careless at all. At the church lich gate, she stopped. There was an umbrella leaning against the post, left behind by someone. It had been there since Sunday, she thought. She had not seen it on Friday. She did not touch it. She noted it. A plain black umbrella, not expensive, with a wooden handle, not a man's umbrella. And it had not rained since Thursday. She went home and told Agnes she had developed a slight headache and was going to sit quietly for the afternoon. Agnes brought her tea and did not disturb her. Miss Marple sat in the chair by the window that faced Church Lane and did not look at the lane. She was thinking about three things: a letter posted from Bristol, a woman in a dark coat, and the particular deliberateness of a hand passing a cup. Outside, the village went about its afternoon. Mr. Ramsay, the schoolteacher, cycled past in the direction of the pub. Mrs. Hartley walked her spaniel. Two children Miss Marple did not know chased something across the green and vanished behind the war memorial. At 4:15, Celia Barton walked past the window on the far side of the lane, carrying a shopping basket and looking at nothing in particular. She did not look toward Agnes's cottage. She walked at a steady pace that was slightly too steady for a woman out buying milk. Miss Marple watched her until she was out of sight. Then she poured herself more tea and sat for a while with the cup cooling in her hands. She was not yet certain. She would need 3 more things, but she had a feeling, the kind that came from 40-odd years of looking at people in small places, that she was not going to like where this one ended. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Doubt. Dr. Pemberton had not said heart failure. That was the difficulty. What he had said to the constable on Monday morning was that the presentation was consistent with cardiac arrest, but that there were 1 or 2 things he would like to think about before signing the certificate. The constable had passed this upward to Inspector Rowe, who had arrived at 11:30 in a state of quiet confidence that tended to survive the early stages of any investigation. Inspector Rowe was 48, had worked his way through every rank in a way that left him with a settled certainty and method. He had a broad face, a habit of listening with his eyes slightly narrowed, and the particular quality of the man who has been right often enough to believe he is right most of the time. He was, Miss Marple thought when she met him on the Wednesday, not unintelligent. He was just incurious. She had met him because Dr. Pemberton had asked her to call. This was slightly unusual, and she had gone without asking for reasons. Dr. Pemberton's surgery was on the far side of the church, a converted cottage with a waiting room that smelled of old magazines and something antiseptic. His housekeeper, Mrs. Drew, showed Miss Marple into the small sitting room behind the surgery and brought biscuits without being asked. Dr. Pemberton was a tall man, gone slightly thin with age, with a face that had weathered into something frank. He sat across from Miss Marple with a cup he did not drink from and said after a minute that he had asked her because Agnes trusted her judgment and because he needed to say something to someone outside the official machinery. He had asked for a post-mortem. Rowe had been resistant, but had agreed. The results would come back in 2 or 3 days. What Dr. Pemberton had noticed, and what he had not said in full to Inspector Rowe because it was not yet a medical conclusion, was this. Edith Crale's color had not been right for a simple cardiac event, and her garden, at the back, had foxgloves. He did not want to be the person who had said it first and been wrong, but he also did not want to be the person who had not said it at all. Miss Marple thanked him for telling her. She asked whether Edith's tea had been tested, and Dr. Pemberton looked at her for a moment and said it had not occurred to him until after Vera Oakes had washed up. The cup was clean, the teapot had been rinsed, the kitchen was tidy. Miss Marple said she had expected that. She asked 3 more questions. Whether Edith had any heart history, which she had not. Whether anyone had been to see her on Sunday evening, which Dr. Pemberton did not know. Whether the foxgloves had been cut recently. He did not know that either, but he offered to go and look, and Miss Marple said it was not necessary yet, because the back garden could be seen from the lane, and she could perfectly well look herself when she passed. She passed on the way home. The foxgloves had been cut heavily along one section of the back wall, recently enough that the stems were still pale at the cut. Not a tidy cut either, the way a gardener cuts. A hurried one. Miss Marple walked home and sat down with her knitting, which she did not make any progress on. The village was doing what villages do when someone dies. It was talking about it. The talking was audible everywhere, in layers. At the level of the pub and the post office, it was general. A sad loss, sudden. 71 was not young, but was not old either. Heart, they thought. At the level of the church, it was slightly more particular. Dorothy Hepburn, the vicar's wife, had organized flowers to be sent to Marion, Edith's daughter, who was expected by Thursday at the latest. At the lower level, the one that ran beneath both of those, something else was moving. Mrs. Hartley had told her husband something on Monday morning. The pub landlord, Alan Mossy, had served 2 separate conversations on Monday evening that touched on the visitor at Edith's gate, which had made the jump from Mrs. Fenwick's counter to the public house in less than 12 hours, which was about average for Little Anzwick. The visitor was the thread that interested everyone. A woman in a dark coat, unknown, who had stood at the gate 3 minutes and then gone in. No one had seen her leave. Miss Marple, on her way back from Dr. Pemberton, had stopped at the pub for a glass of lemonade and had listened to Alan Mossy describe this woman to a table of 3 without being asked. Alan Mossy was a large man with a long memory for anything said over his counter. He had added a detail that Mrs. Fenwick had not mentioned. The woman had a bag, not a shopping bag, something with a flat side like a document case. Miss Marple filed this away. She sat with her lemonade and listened to a man at the next table tell another man that Edith had known something about everyone in the village, and was it not funny how the ones who knew the most tended to go first? His companion said, "That was not funny at all. That was exactly the sort of thing you said about someone when you were glad they were gone." There was a brief silence. Then the first man said he had not meant it like that, and ordered another pint. Miss Marple finished her lemonade and walked home in the long, late summer light, thinking about document cases and foxgloves and a cup that had been washed very thoroughly. Chapter 4. Marion. Marion Crale arrived on the Thursday afternoon train. She was 44, tall in the way her mother had been, but with none of her mother's particular solidity. She had her father's uncertain quality, the look of someone who had spent a childhood being slightly out of step with the house she lived in. She came with a single large case and a man she introduced as a friend, David Ansley, who stood slightly behind her at the station, in the way that people stand when they are not sure whether they belong to the occasion. Miss Marple saw her at Agnes's on Friday morning, when Marion came to call. This was slightly unusual. Marion did not know Agnes well, but she had come, apparently because she did not know where else to go, and had found that the official business of her mother's death, the inspector's questions, the arrangements, the sorting, required more of her than she had expected. She sat in Agnes's parlour and drank tea and looked at her hands. She said her mother had not told her she was expecting anyone on Sunday evening. She said her mother, in fact, had not sounded unusual in her Thursday telephone call, just slightly tight in the way she sometimes got when something was on her mind. Miss Marple asked, gently, whether Edith had mentioned Celia Barton recently. Marion looked up. She said that was an odd question. Then she said, yes, actually. Her mother had said something in June, something Marion had not particularly paid attention to at the time, because her mother frequently made remarks about people that turned out to be more complicated than they first appeared. What she had said was, "Celia is not quite what she has allowed everyone to believe, and I wonder sometimes how long I have known it." Miss Marple asked whether Edith had said anything more specific. Marion said no. And then she said, but there was a letter her mother had written to her in July. A short letter, not like her mother's usual style, very clipped. It had said, "I have been going through some old papers, and I think I will have to do something about Celia." Marion had not known what to make of it, and had meant to ask, and kept not asking, and now of course she could not. Miss Marple thanked her, and asked no more questions about it. She said instead how sorry she was, which she was, and sent Marion home with a pot of Agnes's damson jam, because Agnes had made too much this year, and because it was something solid to carry. After Marion left, Agnes said she supposed Miss Marple knew something she was not saying. Miss Marple said she knew very little yet. She said it in a way that was technically accurate. She was thinking about what kind of something Celia Barton might not be. 19 years in Little Anzwick, a retired librarian from the north, quiet, tidy, helpful. No one had ever checked, because no one ever checks people who are quiet and tidy and helpful. There is no reason to. They give you no reason to, until someone else gives you the reason. She asked Agnes that evening whether she knew anything about Celia's life before Little Anzwick. Agnes thought about it. She said Celia had come after a marriage that had gone wrong, or so everyone had assumed. She never spoke of a husband. She had given her name as Barton, which was her maiden name, Agnes thought, or possibly a name she had taken after. She had money enough to live on, not lavishly but steadily, and no one had asked where it came from. Miss Marple said that was interesting. Agnes said she supposed it was. She asked if she ought to be worried. Miss Marple said she did not think Agnes had anything to worry about personally. She said it in a way that did not quite close the question. She went up to bed at 9:30. She lay in the dark and thought about a woman who had come to a village 19 years ago and been accepted because she was quiet and gave no trouble. She thought about Edith Crale, who had been going through old papers in July. She thought about a document case with a flat side. She thought about a letter posted from Bristol that had arrived a day early. She thought about the foxgloves cut in a hurry and about the teapot washed so clean. She was fairly certain now, not certain in the way that would satisfy a court or even a moderately attentive policeman, but certain in the way she was always certain, the way that came from patterns, from the small shifts in how people moved and what they failed to say. The question was not who had done it. The question was what Edith had known, and how long she had been using it, and whether there was still evidence somewhere that could prove it. She thought the answer to that last question might be yes. She turned over and closed her eyes and was asleep within a few minutes, because there was nothing more she could do until the post-mortem results came back. Chapter 5. Gossip and its Uses. The post-mortem came back on Friday. Dr. Pemberton telephoned Agnes's cottage at 10 in the morning and said 3 words, cardiac glycoside poisoning. He said them quietly, as if volume was part of the problem. Miss Marple had expected this, but hearing it said aloud settled something in her into a colder register. She thanked him and asked whether Inspector Rowe had been informed. Dr. Pemberton said Rowe had been informed at 9 and was at this moment under the impression that the most likely person was David Ansley, Marion's friend, who had no alibi for Sunday evening and who Inspector Rowe had taken an instinctive dislike to on Thursday. Miss Marple said she thought that was probably not right. She spent the rest of Friday thinking about what she did not yet have. She had a why and a how. She did not have a when that was specific enough. She did not have the first contact, the moment when Edith Crale had gone through her old papers and found what she had found and turned it into a weapon. Blackmail. in Miss Marple's experience, was always ultimately self-defeating, not because the person being blackmailed always fought back, but because a person who blackmails tends to believe they have calculated correctly, and they almost never have. They have calculated the other person's tolerance for the financial demand. They have not always calculated the other person's tolerance for the existence of the blackmailer. What had Edith Crale found in those old papers? On Saturday morning, Miss Marple did what she had been doing every few days since her arrival. She went to the post office. She bought 3 stamps she did not need, and asked Mrs. Fenwick how she was getting on. Mrs. Fenwick was getting on in a state of considerable agitation that she was managing with some effort to keep beneath the surface. She said, with her eyes doing most of the communicating, that she had heard something from Dorothy Hepburn, who had it from her husband the vicar, who had it from the verger, who had it from his cousin who worked in the county records office at Market Heathwell. The verger's cousin had, approximately 3 weeks ago, fielded a telephone inquiry from a woman in Little Anzwick about the marriage records for a particular year. The woman had given her name as Crale. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. She asked what year. Mrs. Fenwick did not know the year, but she said the verger's cousin had found it notable enough to mention because marriage records of that type, pre-digital, required a specific request, and the woman had known exactly which year and which county she was looking for. Miss Marple bought her stamps and walked home by a longer route than usual, going past Mill Road where Celia Barton's cottage was. The garden was tidy. The curtains were drawn in the front room, which was slightly unusual for 11 in the morning. She walked on. She was putting it together now, and it was not a complicated picture. It was, in fact, the ordinary picture, the one that recurred in village after village, and had been recurring since long before there were villages of this type to contain it. A woman running from something, a new life, built carefully over years. Someone who had watched the new life being built and who had, at some point, found out what was underneath it. The running was not criminal in itself. Miss Marple thought it almost certainly had to do with a previous marriage, not fully ended before the next one, or possibly a child, surrendered or hidden. She would know more when she could confirm the year. She stopped at the church to look at the notice board. Dorothy Hepburn had put up the revised fete schedule, which had been moved back a week given the circumstances. Beside it was a handwritten notice about the flower arranging, and below that a list of donations already received for the tombola. Celia Barton's name was on the tombola list. She had donated a watercolor she had painted herself, which was noted in Dorothy's handwriting as lovely framed. Miss Marple looked at this for a moment. Then she looked at the umbrella at the lich gate, which was still there. No one had claimed it. She walked back to Agnes's in a thoughtful state and found that Agnes had a visitor, a woman she introduced as Peggy Downs, who had been the schoolteacher before Mr. Ramsay and who had retired to a bungalow on the Heathwell Road 2 years ago. Peggy Downs was 68, vigorous, with the quality of a woman who had spent 30 years managing children and still expected most adults to come up short by comparison. Miss Marple sat and had tea with them and listened to Peggy Downs talk, which she did at length and with great specificity, and at a certain point Peggy said, entirely apropos of something that seemed unrelated, "Of course, I always thought Celia was hiding from someone. People who come to a village and do not talk about before a certain date, they are usually hiding from someone or something. In Celia's case, I assumed a husband, the unpleasant sort. But you never know." Agnes said she had always thought Celia was just a private person. Peggy said private and hiding were not the same thing, and she should know because she had spent 30 years watching children hide things they had done, and the expression was unmistakable once you had seen it enough. Miss Marple said, mildly, that she thought Peggy was quite right, and said it in the particular way that made Agnes look at her with a slight unease that she did not voice. Peggy Downs left at 4. Agnes said, when she had gone, that Miss Marple had a look about her. Miss Marple said, what sort of look? Agnes said, like when you know what is at the bottom of a thing, and you are deciding when to say it. Miss Marple said she was not quite at the bottom yet. There was still one thing she needed. She did not say what it was. She picked up her knitting and counted a row in silence. And Agnes, who had known her for long enough not to push, went to put the kettle on. Chapter 6. The Umbrella. The umbrella had been at the lich gate since Sunday. No one had claimed it, because no one in Little Anzwick owned a plain black umbrella with a wooden handle that was not their usual umbrella. Miss Marple had verified this by the simple method of asking, in the course of 4 separate conversations, whether the person had mislaid an umbrella recently. She asked it as a passing remark each time, the way you ask about weather or the price of things, and 4 times the answer was no. It was not Celia Barton's umbrella, because Celia owned a navy umbrella with a metal handle that could be seen in her front hall through the glass panel of her front door, and Miss Marple had walked past the door twice. It was not Marion's. Marion had arrived on Thursday with no umbrella, which was a detail that would only matter if you were looking for it. The umbrella at the lich gate was the woman in the dark coat's umbrella. The woman who had stood at Edith Crale's gate on Saturday afternoon, 3 days before she died. The woman with the document case. On Sunday afternoon, while Agnes rested, Miss Marple went to the church to speak to the verger. The verger was a small man named Cyril Frost, who had been in the position for 11 years and who treated the church building with the devoted attention of a man responsible for a machine he admired but did not fully understand. She asked him about the umbrella. He confirmed it had appeared on Sunday, as far as he could tell, because he had not seen it on Saturday when he had locked up, and it was there when he came to unlock on Monday morning. Sunday, the night Edith Crale had a visitor. Miss Marple asked whether he had seen anyone at the church on Sunday evening. He had not, but his wife had. His wife, Norma Frost, was a small round woman who appeared from the vestry and told Miss Marple, with the slightly breathless quality of someone releasing something they had been holding, that she had seen a woman walking fast down Church Lane toward the station at approximately 9:15 on Sunday evening. Dark coat, no hat, walking as if she had somewhere to be. Miss Marple asked if she could describe her face. Norma said she had not seen her face. The woman had been walking away. But she was about 40, from her figure and her walk, and she had been carrying something flat. A document case. Miss Marple said thank you, very much, and went home. She sat in the garden until the light began to go, thinking about a woman who had come on Saturday to visit Edith Crale, and then again on Sunday evening, leaving at 9:15. The post-mortem had not specified a time of death, but Dr. Pemberton thought between 9 and midnight, from the temperature. So the woman had been there, near the time. But Miss Marple did not think the woman in the dark coat had killed Edith Crale. She thought the woman in the dark coat was something else entirely, a complication that sat beside the main event without being the main event. She thought about it from the other direction. If she were Celia Barton, and Edith Crale had discovered something about her past and was using it, what would she fear most? Not another visit from Edith. She had managed 19 years of Edith. What she would fear most was something being taken away, something she had, a letter perhaps, or a document, old papers. If Edith had been using county records to research whatever it was she had found, there would be a trail, papers, copies, notes. Edith was a thorough woman. She would have gathered evidence, and if that evidence was at Hawthorne Cottage, and if Celia had known it was there, then Sunday evening was not complicated at all. It was tidy. Hawthorne Cottage had been empty. Vera Oakes did not come on Sundays. The neighbours were far enough. The foxgloves were right there. The question was whether Celia had retrieved everything she had gone for, or whether something remained. Miss Marple did not know the answer to that, but she had an idea about how to find out. She went inside and wrote a short note to Inspector Rowe, which she handed to Agnes's granddaughter who was visiting, who was 15 and had a bicycle, and who thought Miss Marple was rather remarkable, and who cycled to the police house at the constable's end of the village without asking any questions. The note said, "I believe you will find, if you look carefully in the kitchen at Hawthorne Cottage, behind the cookery books on the second shelf, a set of documents that Mrs. Crale kept privately. If they are still there, they are important. If they are not, that is equally important." She signed it and let it go. Then she sat back down in the garden and counted her stitches, because there was still the question of proof, and a note to the police, however accurate, was not in itself a net. She needed the trap. She had almost everything she needed for it. She needed one more day. Chapter 7. What Celia Did. The next morning, Monday, Miss Marple asked Agnes something she had been waiting to ask. She asked whether Agnes had ever heard Celia Barton mention a place called Hadderwick. Agnes said that was in Yorkshire. She thought she had, actually, once, a long time ago, Celia saying something about the north and mentioning Hadderwick in the way you mention a place you would rather not remember. Miss Marple said that was very helpful. She had asked this because Hadderwick was where, according to the county records inquiry that had gone through the verger's cousin, a marriage had been registered in a particular year to a woman named Celia Margaret Renwick, aged 24. Miss Marple had, the previous evening, written to a contact of her own, a solicitor's clerk in Market Heathwell, who owed her a small professional debt, and had asked him to confirm whether this marriage had ever been dissolved. She was fairly confident of what the answer would be. The answer, when it came by return telephone call at 11 on Monday morning, was no. The marriage to a man named Gerald Renwick had not been dissolved. Gerald Renwick had died in 1987, a fact that Miss Marple had not known and that changed the legal situation somewhat. But Celia had not known Gerald Renwick was dead, or so it seemed, because she had never pursued a dissolution. She had simply left, had gone to Little Anzwick as Celia Barton, and had been here since, which made her not a bigamist because Gerald was dead. But it made her a woman living under a name that was not her married name, which was not illegal in itself, but which suggested a great many things she had been keeping careful track of. And the complication that Miss Marple had suspected now became clear. In 1993, 3 years after arriving in Little Anzwick, Celia had entered into a second marriage, brief and quiet, with a man named Thomas Barton, who had died in 1998. She had taken his name. She had been a widow before, technically, from Gerald, but she had not known it. She had entered the Barton marriage as a woman who believed herself to still be married to someone else, which was at that point a criminal act, even if it was later resolved by death. This was what Edith Crale had found. This was what she had gone to the county records for. A marriage, a name, a trail that Celia had hoped time and quiet living had buried. It had not been buried. It had been sitting in the records, in the way inconvenient things do. Miss Marple did not feel the need to admire Edith Crale's thoroughness, but she acknowledged it. She went to see Celia Barton that afternoon. She went alone, without announcement, and knocked on the door of the cottage on Mill Road at 2:15. Celia answered the door in a gardening apron, with secateurs in one hand, and her face, when she saw Miss Marple, was a study in a particular kind of control, the kind that has been rehearsed. Miss Marple said she hoped she was not disturbing her, but she had been meaning to call. She had brought a cutting from Agnes's garden, a rose, which she held up as evidence of good faith. Celia stepped back and let her in. They sat in the front room. Celia made tea. She made it with the precise, careful movements of a woman performing a task she was thinking about too hard. She set the cups out with both hands. She poured, with her wrist held slightly rigid. Miss Marple watched all of this. She was thinking about a woman she had known long ago who had poured tea differently depending on who she was pouring for. For her husband it was flowing, almost careless, the easy gesture of intimacy. For the vicar, it was correct and deliberate, the gesture of someone aware of being observed. Celia Barton poured tea the way you poured for someone you were frightened of. Miss Marple had not been frightened of, so far as she knew, but there was a layer of fear in this room that had nothing to do with Miss Marple personally. It was ambient. It was what happened when someone had been frightened for long enough that the fear became the background color of things. She said, sipping her tea, that she supposed Celia was having a difficult week, with the death and the inspector and everything turned up. Celia said it was very sad, of course. She had been fond of Edith. Miss Marple said she was sure Edith had been very fond of her, too. She said it in a mild way that contained no accusation, and Celia looked at her for a moment with eyes that were doing something more complex than listening. Then Miss Marple said, "I wonder if Edith kept her private letters anywhere unexpected. I always think letters are such revealing things. My niece tells me I write too many of them. But letters have a way of lasting, do they not, when one would prefer they did not?" There was a pause that was not quite short enough. Celia said she would not know where Edith kept her letters. Miss Marple said that was quite all right. She was only wondering. She finished her tea. She said the rose cutting would need water as soon as possible, or it would not take. She said goodbye and walked home by way of the post office to post nothing, and stood for a moment at the counter, while Mrs. Fenwick looked at her with the expression of a woman who knew something had happened and was not going to be told what. Miss Marple said she thought she might ask Inspector Rowe to call on Celia tomorrow, if he had not already. She said it to Mrs. Fenwick as if she were saying it to herself, knowing that the message would travel, because that was the other use of the gossip chain. You could put things into it as well as take things out. She walked home. She thought, one more day, and there will be something either there or not there, and if it is not there, then that too is the proof. Chapter 8. The Second Visit. She was right. The documents were not behind the cookery books. Inspector Rowe sent his sergeant to look, and the sergeant reported back that the shelf behind the cookery books in Hawthorne Cottage's kitchen held 3 cookery books, a jar of dried bay leaves, and a pencil. No documents. Rowe came to tell Miss Marple this on Tuesday morning at Agnes's cottage, because he had by this point decided to treat her information as a resource, even if he remained uncertain what kind. He had been wrong about David Ansley. Ansley had a receipt from a petrol station 40 miles away at 8:30 on Sunday evening, which was inconvenient. Miss Marple told him the documents had been removed, which was itself the significant fact. Rowe said he was aware that something had been removed, but without knowing what had been there, he was not sure what significance to attach to it. Miss Marple said, "The significance is that the only person with a reason to remove them is the person who is mentioned in them, and the person most likely to be mentioned in them is Celia Barton." Rowe looked at her for a moment. He said she was suggesting Mrs. Barton. She said she was not suggesting. She was observing. She told him then what she had learned from the solicitor's clerk. She told him about the marriage in Hadderwick. She told him about Gerald Renwick and the 1993 marriage, and the name. She did not tell him about the foxgloves in Edith's garden, because she was waiting for him to notice that himself. Rowe went away and came back the next morning, which was Wednesday. He sat in Agnes's parlour with his hat on his knee and said that Celia Barton's garden did not contain foxgloves, but that he had spoken to old George Tappett, who lived behind Hawthorne Cottage, and who had seen Mrs. Barton in Edith's back garden on Saturday afternoon at approximately 4 o'clock, which was before the main events, but within visiting distance of the foxgloves. And old George Tappett, who was 81 and slightly deaf, but not at all blind, had seen her cut something from the back wall and put it in her bag. Miss Marple said Saturday was the preparation, Sunday was the use of it. Rose said she was saying Mrs. Barton had been to Hawthorne Cottage twice, once for the foxgloves and once for the night itself. Miss Marple said she was also saying that the woman Mrs. Fenwick had seen with the document case on Saturday afternoon was not Celia Barton. She was someone else entirely. She was, Miss Marple believed, a solicitor's clerk, or an agent of some kind, someone Edith had engaged to research the Hadwick records and bring the results. That was what was in the document case. Rowe looked at her with an expression that was between respect and discomfort and said, "Can you prove any of this?" She said no, not yet, she said, but I believe the documents Celia removed from behind those cookery books may not be entirely destroyed. She said, if I were Celia Barton, I would have burned them. But if Celia were the kind of woman who burned things thoroughly, she would not be in this position. She said, I would like to try something. Rowe said he would listen, which was more than she had expected from him. Chapter 9. The Letter That Survived. The trap was a letter, not a false one. Miss Marple was not in the habit of forging things, and would not have done so now. The letter was real, or rather, its subject was real, because the letter itself was a letter she had sent to Marion Crale, asking Marion whether, among her mother's things, there was any correspondence with a firm of records researchers in Market Heathwell. Marion wrote back within a day. She said she had found, in her mother's desk, a bill from a firm of genealogical researchers for a service dated July. She had not known what to make of it. She had been meaning to query it. She enclosed it. The bill was from a firm in Market Heathwell. It was for professional research into historical marriage records. Hadwick, North Yorkshire. It named the year. It listed the materials delivered. Miss Marple had what she needed. She did not show this to Inspector Rowe directly. What she did was something slightly more careful. She asked Agnes whether she would telephone Celia Barton and say that Marion had been going through Edith's papers and had found some letters she was not sure what to do with. Letters that mentioned Celia, and that Marion was coming to Agnes's on Friday afternoon and Celia might like to come too. Agnes said this felt dishonest. Miss Marple said it was not quite dishonest. Marion really was coming on Friday. And there really were letters that mentioned Celia. She did not say that the letter in question was the bill from the research firm, which Miss Marple now held in her own hands, and which was not precisely the kind of letter Agnes was implying. Agnes, who trusted her, made the telephone call. On Friday afternoon, at 3:15, Celia Barton arrived at Agnes's cottage. She came in her second-best coat, which Miss Marple noted because second-best is what you wear when you want to look unconcerned but are not quite unconcerned enough to dress carelessly. She sat in the parlour. Agnes brought tea. Marion was already there, by the window, looking out at the lane. Inspector Rowe and his sergeant were in the kitchen, which they had agreed to as a condition of Miss Marple's assistance. Miss Marple sat across from Celia and said, quietly, that she wanted to speak to her directly, if that was all right. She said she was very sorry for the position she was in. She said she understood that the thing Edith had discovered was not something Celia had chosen to make secret out of malice, but out of fear, and that 19 years of fear was a very long time. Celia looked at her and said nothing. Miss Marple said, I know about Gerald Renwick. I know about 1993. I know about the Saturday visit to Edith's foxgloves and the Sunday evening. I know about the documents you took from behind the cookery books. Celia was very still. Miss Marple put the bill from the research firm on the table, face up, between them. She said, Edith kept a copy with her researchers. This was the only piece of misdirection in the entire arrangement. The bill was not a copy of anything. It was just the bill. But Celia did not know this, and Celia was looking at it with the expression of a woman who has spent days believing she had cleared the evidence and who is now looking at evidence. She said, in a voice that had gone very flat, I did not mean it to be the amount it was. I only wanted her to stop. Marion, by the window, made a small sound. Celia said, she had been at me for 11 months. 11 months of small amounts, she called them, and they were, at first. And then in July she went to these people, and she had everything written down, and she said she would send it to the parish council and the vicar, and she would put it in the newspaper, and I could not. She stopped. Miss Marple said, quietly, the foxgloves. Celia said, I know about plants. From the library. I have known for years what the garden at Hawthorne could provide if it came to it. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the bill on the table. Miss Marple said, "You went back on Sunday to find the papers." Celia said, "They were not where she had said they were." "I had to look. I was there until nearly 9, and I found them in the kitchen." She looked up, then, at Marion. She said, "I am sorry. I am very sorry about your mother. She was my friend. She was my closest friend for years before this." Marion said nothing. She turned back to the window. Inspector Rowe came in from the kitchen. Chapter 10. What the inspector said. Inspector Rowe was, in the end, fair about it. He said so himself, in the particular way that people say they are being fair when they are aware they have arrived late to the understanding of a situation. He arrested Celia Barton on Wednesday of the following week. The formal charge came after the forensic work confirmed the presence of digitalis glycosides consistent with foxglove extract, in a concentration sufficient to cause the cardiac event recorded in Dr. Pemberton's post-mortem. The extraction method was not sophisticated. It was kitchen chemistry, the kind that a person with access to good reference books and sufficient desperation might arrive at. Rowe held the press statement at the Market Heathwell police offices. He said the investigation had proceeded along careful and methodical lines. He said the breakthrough had come through thorough examination of evidence and detailed witness accounts. He said the name of Miss Jane Marple once, as an afterthought, and even then he attributed her contribution as a useful member of the community who assisted with inquiries, which was not inaccurate in any particular that could be verified. Dr. Pemberton told Miss Marple this when he called at Agnes's. He said it with a slight tightness around the eyes that suggested he found it imprecise. Miss Marple said it was quite all right. She said the police had done the necessary work, which was also not inaccurate. She did not tell Dr. Pemberton about the bill from the research firm and what exactly it had and had not been evidence of. She thought it was probably not worth going into. What she told him instead was that Edith Crale had been, in her opinion, a dangerous kind of person, not evil. That was too large a word for what Edith had been. She had been the kind of person who discovers something that gives her power and who cannot resist using it, because using it confirms to her that the world works in the way she has always believed it does, that knowledge is currency and she has the most of it. Miss Marple had known several people like this. They were always very good at it, right up until the moment when they met someone with fewer alternatives than they had calculated. She had not planned to say this much. It came out because Dr. Pemberton asked what she thought, and he asked it with genuine curiosity and without the inspector's habit of listening only to what confirmed his existing view. She said, "The tragedy is Celia. 19 years of living quietly and doing no harm. A second marriage that was entered into in confusion and fear, not calculation. A life built from nothing, here, that became something, and Edith found the crack in the foundation and pushed, and one morning, at the end of it, Celia walked into a garden with a pair of secateurs and made a decision she had probably been pushing away for years. Dr. Pemberton said that was very sad. Miss Marple said yes, it was. She packed that afternoon. She would take the Thursday morning train back to St. Mary Mead. Agnes said she was sorry to see her go, and meant it. Miss Marple said she would come again in the spring, when Agnes's hip was better, and the village was itself again. She folded her things into her case, and was done by 5. Chapter 11. What Remained. The fete went ahead the following Saturday. Dorothy Hepburn had been careful about this. She had asked, through the usual channels, whether it was appropriate, given everything. The vicar had said he thought Edith would have wanted the fete to continue. This was not quite accurate. Edith would have wanted to chair the fete committee, and since that was no longer possible, she was not in a position to have preferences about continuance. But it was the right thing to say, and it allowed the village to do the right thing. which was to gather in the churchyard and sell jams and run the tombola and let the summer end in the ordinary way. Celia Barton's watercolor was not in the tombola. Dorothy had quietly removed it. She had put it in the vestry. She did not know what else to do with it. Marion Crale stayed until Saturday. She sold Hawthorne Cottage to a couple from London who had been looking in the area for a year. She kept nothing from the house except a small garnet brooch that had been her grandmother's and a cutting from the foxglove bed, which she took because she was not sure why, and then looked at on the train to Bristol, and finally put it in the corridor bin at Swindon. Agnes wrote to Miss Marple in September to say the village had settled. She said it in the way you say a thing has settled, when what you mean is that the event has been absorbed, the way villages absorb things, into the general fabric, the thing that gets talked about for a while, and then referenced, and then becomes one of those stories that begins, when that business happened with Celia Barton. She said Inspector Rowe had been very good in the end about the arrangements. She did not say what the arrangements were, but Miss Marple inferred a successful prosecution from the tone. She said one other thing. She said that on the morning the village had learned about the arrest, Dorothy Hepburn had stood in the post office for a long time without buying anything, and then had said to Mrs. Fenwick that she supposed she ought to have paid more attention at the Fate Committee meeting. Mrs. Fenwick had not known what to say to this. Miss Marple thought she understood it perfectly. There is a particular guilt that attaches to the person who was in the room when something was beginning and did not know to notice. Dorothy had been there. She had written down Edith's unresolved resolutions in her neat hand. She had watched Celia pass Edith her cup with that careful precision. She had not known what it meant, and she blamed herself for not knowing. Miss Marple wrote back to say that not knowing was the ordinary condition of things, that most cruelty happened in plain sight and was mistaken for something else, because people are not, in general, watching for it. She said that Dorothy should not spend herself on that kind of guilt. She said the kind of attention required to see things that are being carefully hidden is not something one person in 100 has reliably, and that having it was not a virtue so much as an accident of the way one had spent one's time. She wrote this and then sat with it for a moment. She read it back. She thought it was more or less right. She sent it. She set the letter aside and picked up her knitting. Outside the window, St. Mary Mead in September was doing what it always did. The baker's boys cycling past, the leaves going at the copper beech, Mrs. Price from the end of the lane leading her dogs with their particular air of knowing exactly where they were going. The village went on. She thought about Celia Barton in a cell somewhere, or in a remand facility, or wherever they had put her while the wheels of the official process turned. She thought about 19 years of a quietly built life. She thought about a cup of tea passed with both hands. She thought, people are always more complicated than the thing they did. This is not the same as saying the thing they did was all right. It is only to say that there is always a long corridor behind the thing, a corridor full of ordinary doors, and the thing at the end of it looks different depending on where you are standing. She thought about Dorothy Hepburn's guilt, and Marion Crale's silence on the train, and Mrs. Fenwick watching the lane, and the umbrella at the lich gate that nobody had claimed, and whether anyone had gone back for it. 2 women who would never speak again, one dead, one gone. 19 years of Sunday afternoon tea, of fate committees and shared walks, and the ordinary closeness of village women who had chosen the same place to live. All of that had been real. The fear had been real too. Both things had existed at the same time, in the same rooms, in cups handed back and forth. Miss Marple had seen it before, this particular kind of grief that does not have a clean name. She had seen it in enough villages. She did not think she would stop seeing it. She counted a row and turned her knitting. Outside, the copper beech was burning. End! Inspired by the world of Agatha Christie. No rights claimed, no connection to any estate,